Right, so today we are going deep on Graham Linehan.
Oh, this will be interesting.
Yeah, this is going to be a fascinating one. Linehan, of course, you know him from Father Ted, the IT crowd,
Classic show.
all-time classics. But he has become a very controversial figure due to his very public and very strong criticisms of aspects of the transgender rights movement.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to understand Linehan's perspective, the arguments he's making,
Dive into it.
lay it all out there, and, let you think critically.
Exactly. And I think what's so fascinating here is that Linehan now considers himself a journalist, which is an interesting development for, somebody who came up as a comedy writer.
Yeah, it's a big shift.
Yeah, and I think that shift in itself kind of speaks to some of the heart of the debate here, which is about free speech and, what are the consequences when you voice opinions that maybe go against the grain or are considered controversial?
Yeah, for sure. And we've got a few sources here.
Okay.
We've got Linehan's own words from his Substack, The Glinner Update. We
Yeah.
got a transcript of a YouTube interview he did with Sasha Ayad. And then we've got some social media posts sprinkled in there just to kind of fill in some of the gaps.
Yeah, so we're really getting not just what Linehan's saying, but we're also seeing the reactions that he provokes.
Exactly. And one of the first incidents that really blew up was Linehan's prank, as he called it, on the lesbian dating app, Her.
Right.
And basically what he did was he created profiles presenting as a lesbian, even using, photoshopped pictures of himself with makeup
Oh, wow.
to make this point about what he sees as men encroaching on spaces that should be for lesbians.
Right. And, it wasn't just a random act of, trolling or whatever. He was using satire, obviously very controversial satire, but he was trying to use that to highlight this concern that some lesbians have, that they're losing these spaces that are meant exclusively for women.
Yeah, and that prank, as he called it, had consequences. He got a lot of criticism from various people.
Yeah, a lot of pushback.
Yeah, and in particular, journalists Katie Herzog and Jesse Singal, who both have written about, gender and trans issues quite a bit, they were very critical of him, accused him of transphobia, of misgendering.
Yeah, and it's here where I think the debate gets, even more heated, because Linehan then fires back and says that Herzog and Singal are only, twisting his actions to protect their own careers. And he even claims that he emailed Herzog about a pedophile ring on Reddit,
Oh,
which he says she ignored.
wow. And so he's really sort of driving home this point that he's trying to raise this very serious issue.
Yeah, and he even points to these images that he shares on his Substack of these men who he claims were on this app posing as lesbians. And then also he highlights women being banned from Her for stating a preference for dating biological women.
And so this raises the question, right? Where's the line between inclusivity and self-identification, and then the concerns of, women, in particular lesbians in this case, feeling like they're being pushed out of spaces that they see as their own.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not just about a dating app.
Right, it's much bigger.
It's about the bigger picture.
It's about, how do we navigate these evolving ideas about identity and belonging?
Right. And then to make matters even more, I guess, explosive, you could say, Linehan used the term grooming in a tweet that was directed at a UC Berkeley professor, Grace Lavery. And he later clarified that he wasn't accusing Lavery of being a pedophile, but he was using grooming to describe what he sees as a broader societal push to normalize certain elements of trans ideology.
Right.
He actually makes a comparison to the Catholic Church's influence in Ireland.
Wow.
And he argues that even taboos against, dead naming or showing photographs of trans individuals can be harmful in some contexts.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a very strong claim.
Yeah.
And he goes as far as to say that the normalization of certain fetishes could make women and children more vulnerable to abuse.
Oh, wow.
So you can see how concerned he is about the potential consequences of what he sees as unquestioning acceptance of certain ideas.
Yeah, for sure. And this kind of goes back to this whole thing about Linehan becoming a self-proclaimed journalist, right?
Yeah.
He feels that mainstream media is ignoring these issues, so he's kind of taken it upon himself to report on them, mainly through his Substack.
Right, and he's very critical of other journalists.
Oh, yeah, especially, Herzog and Singal, who we mentioned before.
Right.
He says that they are choosing career preservation over covering these very sensitive topics.
Yeah, his argument is that fear of being canceled is stopping honest reporting, and he uses this term Vichy feminism.
Oh, wow.
to describe this.
A loaded term, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to how strongly he feels that these issues are tied to power dynamics.
Yeah, very much so.
And it's interesting, he also draws a parallel between this and his experience with Father Ted, which, was a show that satirized the Catholic Church.
Right.
And he believes that that show, while funny, actually helped to chip away at the church's authority, particularly after the abuse scandals came to light.
So in a way, he's implying that humor and satire can be tools for challenging those in power,
Right.
even if there's a risk of serious backlash.
Right.
And he's definitely experienced that backlash.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact that the police showed up at his door over complaints about his tweets, that's a real-world consequence.
Yeah.
That raises some big questions about, the limits of free speech and how law enforcement is used in these kind of online disputes.
Absolutely. And, he finds support from others who are in this, what's often called the gender-critical movement, people like the feminist writer Helen Joyce.
Right.
So that solidarity seems really crucial for him.
Yeah, it makes sense, when you're facing such strong criticism.
Especially when you feel like you're kind of out there on your own.
It speaks to the importance of community and solidarity.
Yeah.
And this is why I think this debate about transgender rights is just so, far from over. That There's such deeply held beliefs on all sides of this.
And that's what makes this, I think, so complex and frankly uncomfortable to discuss.
Right.
But it's through explorations like this, considering these different perspectives and challenging our own assumptions, that we can start to understand the nuances of this.
For sure.
It's not about easy answers. It's about diving into the gray areas.
Yeah, and, you might completely disagree with Linehan's methods, but I do think that his core argument is worth considering.
Yeah.
Which is that if fear of being canceled is shutting down these important conversations, then how do we create these spaces for open and honest dialogue about these tough topics without resorting to personal attacks or silencing tactics?
That's the question, right?
Yeah, that's a question we all need to grapple with.
We're going to grapple with more of it when we come back after a quick message.
All right, sounds good.
So we were just talking about, Linehan comparing this, current climate to the Catholic Church's influence in Ireland.
Right.
This idea that, people who criticize certain aspects of trans ideology face a similar kind of silencing that protected abusers within the church. That's a pretty bold claim, but really gets to the heart of, his concerns about power and who gets to control the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that in Linehan's focus on organizations like Stonewall, which is, a major LGBTQ plus rights group in the UK.
Right.
He argues that they've been heavily influenced by queer theory. And in his view, they've pushed other institutions like, for example, the Girl Guides.
The Girl Scouts, basically.
Yeah, exactly, to adopt policies that he finds dangerous.
And he specifically brings up the case of Helen Watts,
Right.
who was a Girl Guide leader who was let go after voicing concerns about Stonewall's guidelines.
Right.
She felt like those guidelines compromised the safety of young girls.
And so Linehan's argument is that these guidelines could potentially allow men who declare a trans identity to bypass safety measures that would normally apply to any other man. And he finds this especially worrisome because those individuals might then gain access to female-only spaces, including overnight trips with young girls.
Right. It's not just about rules on paper. He sees it as a systemic issue.
Yeah.
Where certain groups are placed beyond reproach.
Right.
Which can create a dangerous environment.
Right. And then he also points to this case of Amy Challenger, who was a trans activist who was appointed to a government advisory role in the UK. Mm-hmm. But then she had to resign when it came out that her partner had been convicted of possessing child abuse images.
Right. And this case for Linehan really exemplifies this pattern he sees of overlooking or minimizing problematic behavior within the trans community because of this sacred caste status.
They can do no wrong.
Yeah. And he argues that this not only shields abusers, but it also fosters a climate of fear where people are hesitant to speak up because they don't want to be labeled transphobic.
Right. You can't question anything.
And so he connects this right back to journalism. He says that reporters like Herzog and Singal are actually contributing to this silencing. By either avoiding these issues or by misrepresenting the concerns of those who are raising them.
So their motivation is?
He thinks that they're more concerned with protecting their own social standing and avoiding being canceled than they are with pursuing the truth.
Okay, interesting.
So this is really fascinating how Linehan frames this transformation of himself, right?
Sure.
From comedy writer to self-described journalist.
Mm-hmm.
He feels like he's been forced into this role because, in his view, the mainstream media outlets are failing to cover these stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're choosing to protect the status quo.
Interesting.
And so his Substack, the Glenner Update,
Mm-hmm.
becomes his platform for
Okay.
publishing these investigations, these stories that he feels are being ignored or suppressed.
Right. And he points to things like the story that he broke about Nathaniel Knight, who was this Reddit moderator who admitted to pedophilia.
Right, and had links to Amy Challenger.
Exactly. And this is his evidence. This is proof that he's doing, real reporting.
Right.
Which raises a very interesting question about who gets to decide what journalism is these days, right?
Right.
Is it only the domain of these established institutions, or can individuals like Linehan, also claim that mantle?
Yeah, and Linehan clearly believes he can,
Right.
and he's not afraid to use his platform, even if his methods are, controversial.
And he has brought attention to some very uncomfortable questions.
Right.
Honestly, a lot of people would rather just avoid.
Yeah, and, you might agree with him or not,
Right.
but it's really hard to ignore the issues that he's raising,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you consider, what could be the potential consequences of silencing dissenting voices.
It does make you wonder, right? Like, how do we balance the need to protect vulnerable groups with the right to express dissenting opinions?
Right, especially ones that might be considered deeply unpopular or even offensive to some.
Yep.
And how do we even determine what constitutes harmful speech, especially when the lines can be so blurry?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, and it's something that societies have struggled with for centuries.
For sure.
But it feels especially urgent now in our, digital world where information spreads so rapidly,
Right.
and it can really shape public discourse.
And this is where Linehan's comparison to that Do It to Julia scene from 1984 comes into play.
Right.
He's basically arguing that this fear of social and professional repercussions is pushing people to, betray their own beliefs.
To conform.
Yeah, and just comply with a dominant ideology, even if they have, private doubts or concerns.
Yeah, so he's saying it's like self-censorship,
Right.
driven by fear.
Yeah, fear of being ostracized, of losing your job, of facing online harassment.
And, journalists are just as vulnerable to those kinds of attacks as anyone else.
Oh, yeah, and Linehan himself has been targeted.
Right, he talks about receiving threats, things delivered to his doorstep.
It's scary stuff.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that these online disputes, they can have very real consequences
Offline.
in the offline world. Yeah, exactly.
Especially when you're dealing with these deeply personal issues.
Right.
But Linehan is insistent that it's essential to resist those silencing tactics and keep these conversations going.
Yeah, even when they're really difficult.
Yeah, and he calls for solidarity among those who share his concerns. This idea that by uniting and speaking out, they can challenge the prevailing narrative and create space for alternative viewpoints.
And that's a really crucial point, right? Like, how do we have these open and honest dialogues on these complex issues without resorting to, these personal attacks and these attempts to just silence people who have different views?
Right. It's easy to dismiss Linehan's views outright.
Yeah.
But I think it's much more challenging and ultimately more productive to actually engage with what he's saying.
To try to understand.
Yeah, and try to understand where he's coming from.
And, you might disagree in the end, but at least you've had that conversation.
But at the heart of this, right, are these fundamental questions.
About
free speech,
Yeah.
about the role of the media in shaping public opinion.
Yeah.
And even, the very nature of what it means to be male or female in the 21st century.
Yeah, these are not easy questions.
Not at all.
And there are no easy answers.
And ignoring them doesn't make them go away.
Right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's think about the bigger picture here.
Okay.
What are the potential dangers of silencing dissenting voices,
Yeah.
even those that we find offensive or harmful?
Right.
How can we make sure that marginalized groups are protected
Yeah.
without at the same time stifling debate or shutting down critical inquiry?
It's a tough balancing act.
It is, and these are questions that deserve a lot of careful consideration,
For sure.
not just in the context of this specific controversy,
Right.
but in the broader context of how we navigate these really complex issues as a society. Man, we've covered some heavy stuff.
Yeah, don't get out.
Accusations of silencing, this whole idea of the role of the media, and what happens when you shut down conversations.
It's a lot.
It really is a lot to think about, but I think it's so important to look at it from all sides.
It's easy to just say, oh, Linehan's just trying to get attention.
Right.
But that doesn't really deal with the core concerns
Yeah.
that he's putting out there. What are the risks if we just make certain viewpoints completely off limits?
Right.
And what happens if people are just too scared to speak up?
Yeah, I mean, how do you deal with stuff that's this complicated, this sensitive, without just shutting down the whole conversation or going straight to attacking each other?
Right. It's like we've got to find a better way.
And I think Linehan's, his story, in a way, it's almost like a case study
In what way?
for this whole new world we're in, online, all this discourse.
Yeah, it's a different landscape.
He's this lightning rod for controversy.
No doubt.
But by being that, he's kind of forcing us to talk about these big things. Like, where's the line for tolerance? What does free speech even mean anymore? And, do we have a responsibility to at least try to understand ideas that are hard?
That's the part people skip over, right? It's not about agreeing. It's the try that matters.
I feel like he's become like this symbol for, so many people who are just worried about saying the wrong thing, like one word, and your whole life blows up.
Professionally, socially. Yeah.
It's happening everywhere.
Oh, for sure. This goes way beyond Linehan, beyond trans rights even.
It's like, how do we even have these debates anymore when everything is so polarized?
Everyone's on edge,
The stakes feel so high.
and everyone wants you to pick a side.
Like, so what does this mean for everyone listening?
That's the question, right?
Like, how do we take all this and actually make it useful?
I think what Linehan shows us, even if you hate his tactics, even if you think his conclusions are wrong, is you can't avoid these hard talks.
We try to.
We do. We surround ourselves with people just like us.
Safe and comfortable.
But that's not where you learn.
Where you grow.
It's when you're a little uncomfortable, when someone has a viewpoint you've never considered.
When you have to listen, really listen.
Yeah, try to get where they're coming from, have empathy,
Even if you walk away still disagreeing.
because the worst thing we can do is pretend the other side doesn't exist.
That's what silencing does. It hurts everyone.
And this is going to sound cheesy, but you gotta have courage.
To do what?
Speak your mind, even when you know it'll piss people off.
Especially then, almost.
Because if we don't have that real progress, it's impossible.
It comes from those messy, awkward dialogue.
Real conversation.
So look, I know this has been intense, this whole deep dive.
It always is with this kind of topic.
Keep thinking about this stuff. Don't be scared to ask questions.
Challenge yourself.
Yeah, find different viewpoints. See if you still believe the same things.
The point isn't to have all the right answers, it's to think.
That's what we've tried to do here.
Wrestle with the complexity of it all.
So thanks for joining us, everyone.